Hey guys, Cribbin Governor from the Gut Health Gurus podcast. I've got a background in food science, and today we have an absolutely amazing guest lined up for you. I'm super excited to have this conversation with Dr. Emeran Mayer, one of the foremost experts when it comes to the gut brain connection and how the gut affects our psychology, our mental health. And this is like a topic that's so interesting to me. It's so important to me. So to get this opportunity to talk to Dr. Emeran Mayer is an absolute honor. Dr. Emeran Mayer, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Kriben, for the invitation and the exuberant introduction. I feel kind of embarrassed to live up to what you built me up here, but I'll do my best. And as you just told me, we first met 6 years ago at an early microbiome meeting, and which I had forgotten. So it's actually nice to talk to you again.
It's
Looking
my
forward to
absolute
it.
pleasure to have you, Emeran. I'm so nervous to talk to you. I don't often get nervous with guests, but because you're such a hero to me, hopefully I can do justice as well and hold it together. And what I like to do at the start of the show is to get it straight from the horse's mouth. Who is Dr. Emeran Mayer?
Well, I'm a gastroenterologist. I've seen hundreds, maybe thousands of patients in my career. I've also have a career-long interest in or pursuit of the science of brain-gut interactions and the last 10 years of brain-gut microbiome interactions. Um, and I think it's now almost 10 years ago or close to that I came out with my first book, The Mind-Gut Connection, and which actually influenced my trajectory. So I got this almost like this second hat now that I'm wearing, which is essentially communicating to the public, to communicate all the scientific breakthroughs that are happening or have happened in microbiome science and in gut health. Um, which I think the lay public has heard about, different sections, but then unfortunately, the people that are communicating that information are not necessarily the scientists or the main player in the field. They're self-appointed, influencers, and so it's become a very prominent task for me to really fill that vacuum with, evidence-based, scientifically based information.
I completely hear you. Amazing introduction just to know your background and how prominent you are in this field. And I'm in complete agreement that we see this sort of social media landscape with all the different social media platforms. And then you've got these influencers coming up, well meaning as well, trying to get this message out there. But what I like to do is on this podcast to lean on the experts in the field, the people that are doing the research, and to get that information straight from you guys. And it takes a long time to go from a clinical study to the lay public. And what I'm trying to do is really close that gap. So 100% agree with what you're saying. And I think a good way to start this podcast is to be really relevant today. So I'm kind of doing it opposite to how I normally do it, but let's talk about cutting edge discoveries and get that information straight to the public. So, what is the most surprising new discovery about the gut brain connection that you've encountered in recent research?
Well, I would say for me, the most surprising finding was really in the early days of this brain gut microbiome field. Were so I've worked on brain gut interaction scientifically all my career, and we were the first ones to use brain imaging to see what happens in the brain if you stimulate the gut, and what happens in the gut when you stress the brain with emotional stimuli and stress stimuli. And we really thought we had figured it all out. We didn't think were too many holes in that story. And then when the first papers came out from animal studies, John Cryan and his lab and a few others in the world. I was very skeptical. I thought this was just not necessary, kind of naive in retrospect. And so I think these early findings, it took me a couple of years to really accept those and then, do our own first human study where we demonstrate this effect of a probiotic mix on brain circuits in healthy women. So this discovery that there's something non-human in our intestine that essentially uses the brain gut or the gut brain connection for its own purposes that's still an amazing, and there's a lot of stories to that why this is so exciting, um, and it doesn't really stop at the microbes in our gut, because these microbes you know, are nurtured by the food that we eat, and the plants particularly, are greatly influenced by another microbiome in the soil. So we have this external um, mechanism where, like the roots of the plants are kind of like the gut of is our gut. So the roots interact with the soil microbes, and then the soil microbes stimulate the plant to produce molecules that help the plant survive and defend the health of the plant. And then when we eat these plants, our microbes pick up these same molecules that their cousins in the soil stimulated. And then we pick those up, and then they become health benefits for us, for our brain. I mean, it's that to me is still one of the most amazing stories in this field.
That's amazing. I completely agree, Dr. Mayer, that the soil and the gut, there's this kind of this comparison between the two. The roots of the plants going into the soil is like the enteric nervous system going into the gut. So there's certainly this amazing concept that nature's put together for us. And then my initial follow-up question is, how do you think the impact on agriculture and the development of agriculture has influenced the gut and then our mental health?
Yeah, so this is an interesting story. People always say, in order to feed the billions of people in the world, we need to expand conventional agriculture first with chemical fertilizers, which has done wonders. It's prevented mass starvation in the world, and we totally accept it as a normal. Um, a normal part of agriculture now. And I'll come back to this, why this is really a mistake. And the second one is like things like um, hydroponics to grow tomatoes and other vegetables in water without soil. It's another thing that's being celebrated. This is important to further expand our food production because, in my opinion, we don't really have to expand our food production. If we change the way that we don't throw away half of it, of the foods that are being produced, there will be enough food for 8 or 10 billion people in the world. But people like these modern fads, I would say, not thinking about the consequences. And just what I said a minute ago, why chemical agriculture, for example. So the plants are growing beautifully. They're getting bigger. The fruits and everything is bigger. Go to the market, see these beautiful things. If you go to an organic, farmers market on the weekend, the foods don't look that nice. They're not comparable. So, but what happens? The nutrients, the phytonutrients in these plants that are grown in an organic or regenerative organic soil. The concentration is much, much higher. And when we eat these beautiful plant products that are grown with chemical agriculture, it's like plants being on steroids, but they contain less and less of these health promoting molecules the consequences on the one side, the plants are more susceptible now to diseases and to insects and pests and fungi and UV light. So we need to add this on top of these plants that are already grown chemically, with with all the um, with all these fungicides and insecticides, and um, so this has sort of multiple consequences. Now, ultimately, it's particularly important today. So I'm promoting a largely plant-based diet. But when you think about that, most of our plants, so certainly in North America, are grown with, with GMO. It's not the gene modification. It's actually what we spray on these GMO produced products. Um, and and also, I mean, the way that they're grown without this natural system of soil microbes stimulating their health benefits. So we think we're doing something good for our health, but in reality, these are depleted products. These are not. They still have the vitamins. They still have other phytochemicals in it, but some key components like the polyphenols are devoid in these plants, and that has been shown. So if you want to eat a real healthy diet, it's not just what you eat, but also where this food comes from and how it is grown. Uh, and I do know I'm not following that very closely what happens in Europe, but um, I do think that many things are grown less with 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 the kind of chemical agricultural means in Europe, certainly certain parts of Europe, than there are in the US and Canada. Yeah, so we need to pay attention to, as I said, not just that we eat enough 75% plant-based foods, but also how is this food produced? Does it still have the input from the microbes that stimulate their own health benefits, which is then transferred to us?
That's incredible. In complete agreement with everything you said, there's a consequence for modern agricultural techniques. And I had no idea. This is the first I've ever heard about the polyphenol content of the vegetable being impacted by the way it's grown. So thank you for sharing that amazing information. So just to follow on, so by using these GMO type crops and then spraying chemicals like glyphosate or the like, how does this impact the our bodies and our microbiome when we consume that?
Yeah, so glyphosate, that's a good example. That when this was originally approved by the FDA, it was based on in vitro studies on cell systems, and so glyphosate did not have a negative effect on these isolated cells, and that's because human cells or animal cells don't have um, the enzymes that metabolize glyphosate into dangerous chemicals. But now we know that some microbes do have these enzymes. So most of the time, the microbes are doing positive things for us. Um, they make us they make a lot of large molecular structures absorbable. So in general, I would say most of the things that they do are positive. But some of these chemical transformations that they do with chemicals that they have not seen in their own evolution, um, they may turn them into actually more dangerous, products that then can harm us. And it's sort of amazing. And I don't know, so I'm certainly not somebody, who believes in conspiracy theories, but I once had somebody come to my office very secretively, and he told me that whole story, how the agricultural lobby has kind of suppressed all these research efforts on glyphosate, more detailed studies, because today we could actually show that it's and as you know, there are big lawsuits against Bayer, so there's a lot of work behind the scene to actually not make it public what this microbial process glyphosate can do to us harmfully.
That's incredible. That's an absolute bombshell. I had no idea that conversion of these chemicals like glyphosate happen in the gut by the microbes to potentially produce negative adverse effects. That's stunning to me. I've never heard of that. So thank you so much for sharing that information.
I could add a couple of things to this. So this is what we call so glyphosate would be a xenobiotic, so a foreign product that the microbes encounter. I mean, the microbes had billions of years of evolution in the oceans of the world, so they became the masters of intercellular communication and communication with the organic environment and then with the first animals, and they have accumulated all this wisdom in millions of genes, 100 times more genes than we have. But obviously, they have not been exposed to all these modern chemicals. I don't know how many, if it's 100 chemicals or 1,000 chemicals that modern humans are exposed to. Just to name a few of them, the microplastics, for example. I mean, microbes in the evolution never encountered plastics, but they do know how to break them down. And that's true about all the medications we're taking. The microbes are sort of like a second liver. They can metabolize a lot of the medications. And sometimes it's, as I said, it's beneficial. In other times, like with the main Parkinson medication, they actually introduce this variability that physicians encounters when they prescribe these medications. In some people, it doesn't work at all. In other people, it has major side effects. Probably a big part of this is the role of the variable role of the microbiome on these on these Parkinson medications.
Incredible. And I'm sure there's so many other conversion processes that are happening in the gut via the microbiota and their genes that could be leading to potentially negative outcomes, but also positive outcomes as well. So they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So there's also good and bad. But I love how you highlight the point that modern inventions, these chemicals that these microbes might not be have exposed to in the past could be leading to detrimental effects holistically on the body.
Absolutely. I just want to come back to a positive effect and with potentially huge implications, and that's it's the microplastics. So certain microbes can break down microplastics in CO2 and water. So companies, there's one particularly, actually I'm an advisor to this company called Melius. They're working on microbial strains, on beneficial microbial strains that are specializing in breaking down the microplastic that you would ingest into water and CO2, so totally harmless substances. And I think when you look around, I mean, there's no good chance in the next, I don't know, 20 years that we get rid of our plastics. People already can detect microplastics in the heart and in the testicles, and we have no idea what effects those have. So since we're unlikely to change our behavior in using plastics for everything, including the vegetables we buy in the market, which I think are healthy, something like this, a breakthrough that of a bioengineered microbe that can actually convert, this microplastic into totally harmless substances would be phenomenal, and my prediction would be, I'm somewhat biased because I'm affiliated with this company, but my prediction would be that these are likely scenarios to happen, that you modify the genetic code of certain microbes to add functions that the microbes didn't learn in the 4 billion years when they were around, but that we have to add today because we're dealing with all kinds of new chemicals and perturbations of that system. So
That's incredible. I mean, it's huge news over the last couple of years on the accumulation of bioplastics into the body through the environment. And you're absolutely right. Now, microplastics are not going away anytime soon. So it's so exciting to hear these sort of developments in synthetic biology to actually mitigate some of these risks of microplastics. So, just one follow up question. If you could share, and I understand it could be confidential, but broadly speaking, are we talking about lactobacilli type bacteria or bifidobacteria breaking down these plastics?
Yeah, so these will be microbes from that normally grow in our intestine, but changing something in their genetic code that they now are able to, when they encounter a microplastic, that they actually, metabolize it. So that whole technology of, you know, synthetic, biology or this engineering, genetic engineering of microbes, it has a negative bite taste for a lot of people. They think, oh my God, we don't need, genetically modified foods and microbes. But I think there's an opportunity to use an amazing system that we have living inside of us for certain, once we know it's safe, I mean, obviously you always need to make sure that whatever you change in this genetic code does not have unintended consequences, like releasing rabbits in Australia, so something like that.
Absolutely. Or foxes or feral cats and goats and all sorts of donkeys, all sorts of weird and wonderful things. I also have mixed thoughts on synthetic biology, but it's use cases like this this particular example that excites me because we know we have this problem that's very difficult to solve, and we're seeing more and more research coming out on the accumulation of these plastics in the body. So I'm very open to exploring solutions to these particular issues. And one thing I'd like to come back on is when you mentioned the difference between hydroponic foods and like organically grown vegetables in the soil. Could you speak a little bit about the actual amount of bacteria that's actually coming via the consumption of foods that are grown in the soil?
You mean the bacteria that we ingest from the
Yeah.
food in the
Yes,
soil?
the load.
Um, that's not the main thing that I've been thinking about really. This may be more important. I mean, the way that, there's a lot of root products that for example, in traditional medicinal practices, ginger and turmeric. I mean, there's a lot of roots. I don't know how much of these bacteria that live in the what's called a rhizosome, basically these rootlets that come out, how many bacteria are left after drying and processing and turning these roots into powder. Um, there's certainly, and there have been studies like on oranges um, that are organically grown, how many bacteria are coating the peel of the oranges, and that's very true about most foods. I do not know. I couldn't give you an informed answer really what importance that has. I think it's more important the role of the microbes in the development of these plant-based products, as we told earlier, interacting with the roots or with the leaves. If you take that away, then one whole class of molecules, of beneficial molecules like the polyphenols, and I should say polyphenols, that's a very interesting group of molecules. So it means many phenols. So phenol is a ring, is a chemical ring. So polyphenols, many of those linked together to making up a very big molecule that cannot be absorbed in our first half of the small intestine because we don't have the enzymes to break it down, and it's too big to be absorbed, passively. So we need the microbes to break those down into smaller molecules in the end of the small intestine and in the first part of the colon. And so those are the molecules that are like that reflect the history of the plant. How did it evolve? How was it grown, and what encounters did it have while it was in the soil? And if that's taken away, and I mean, if and we never did that study, but we had planned a study where we compare the polyphenol content of plants grown in the laboratory, with regenerative organic soil. And so regenerative organic is another, for people who don't know this, it's a movement right now, luckily a rapidly growing movement. We don't just avoid chemicals, but you actually give back to the soil. You don't just take out, all the nutrients and deplete the soil, but you give back by um, the various crop rotation and various, you know, techniques that have been shown to be practical and also are cost effective. It's not that regenerative organic agriculture is this hippie way of making things that would never make money. There are people. There's a person, Joel Saladin, a farmer in Virginia, who was clearly shown that this can be, mass can that food can be mass produced with that technology and with making sufficient profits. So that rationale that you can't make a business out of this is totally wrong. It's a myth promoted by the agricultural lobby, by the industrial agricultural lobby.
I hear you. So if I could summarize, going back to the plant story. So it's not so much about the microbes that we're ingesting. It's more about the conversion of these chemicals via the soil organisms that are then having a flow-on effect onto how these chemicals interact, or these microbes particularly interact in the body. So there's this whole pathway that's been taken out by excluding the soil microbes, potentially by damaging them using chemicals and things like that, or using hydroponics where you're just taking the soil completely out. And then you moved on to talking about regenerative agriculture, which I'm a huge proponent and fan of. Hugely important in terms of the quality of meat that's produced and also the environmental benefits for sure. So, do you have any comments? Because I'm getting a lot of questions these days about a particular chemical that's been introduced into the agricultural world, especially when it comes to cattle raising. It's called Bovar. Have you ever come across that?
No, I've not. I've not. I'd
Uh,
love to hear from you about it.
So it's basically consumers that are asking us about the addition of Bovar into the animal's life cycle, I assume via some sort of supplement that suppresses methane production. So there's a huge public backlash against Bovar at the moment. So you might not be aware of that, but that's certainly happening. But to your point, my personal take in, I don't know what the flow-on effect is by introducing this chemical into the meat. It's an unknown to me what the downstream effects are on the microbiome, because a lot of the methane is, I'm assuming, going to be produced by the microbes in the cow's gut.
Yeah, the fermentation, yeah, the whole digestive process in cows, the fermentation um, is something that's totally dependent on microbial populations, and uh, you know, and that has been influenced really by the way that um, in meat production, so they use corn instead of grass. Which is harmful for the cow's digestive system and causes inflammation. That's sort of a good example, completely ignoring really the role that has evolved over thousands of years in the ancestors of cows and bisons and other wild animals. That um, Yeah, we've sort of, much in this field of nutrition and food production has ignored for a long time the key role that microbes have in it, in many different ways. And um, when new things come up, I mean, another example, like where microbes also might potentially have an important role. So most of our farm animals that are raised in, really horrible conditions in many parts of the world, when you think about the mass production, um, so a large percentage of these animals have inflammation of their intestine, of their large intestine. So even though they're considered healthy, if you take biopsies or if you look at inflammatory mediators, they have this, widespread inflammation due to several factors, to the chronic stress, but also the way they're being fed, um, and and the microbes certainly play an important role in that as well, because they normally would have, could have an anti-inflammatory effect through production of butyrate on these processes. Um, and I should come back to this, I mean, I definitely don't want to be a salesperson for genetically engineered microbes, but another way that this is being addressed right now is by, again, modifying microbes or probiotics that are normally don't like to be in an environment of inflammation, to alter these microbes that they actually thrive in an inflammatory environment and produce their anti-inflammatory substances, butyrate, and that which is sort of like the endogenous aspirin of the body, or the microbiome. Um, so those probiotics, the genetically engineered probiotics, also have shown early beneficial effects in animal models, pre-traumatic. So it could well be that we're going to harness in the next, version 2.0 or 3.0 of the probiotics, a lot of possible real health benefits. I mean, today probiotics, I think, for a lot of people, they like them, they feel better, but they don't have the dramatic effects that we might get with the second generation or the third generation that I mentioned, where we can treat not just diseases of humans, but I mean, when you think about what a crazy situation that we eat meat from animals that are sick, basically,
Mm,
be- because the way they're raised and what they fed and the antibiotics that they get, um, it's certainly another reason for people that don't eat meat or red meat not to eat it, because
hmm.
it's, um, yeah, having learned about this ubiquitous role of gut inflammation in modern agriculture. So we talked about the chemical agriculture, which is so damaging to the plants. Now we're talking about raising animals, where it's equally detrimental. And the sad thing is, all of this is being supported by subsidies from the government. I mean, the U.S. government spends hundreds of millions, maybe billions, in subsidies on many of these unhealthy farm practices. So I think raising awareness of this by the consumer, it has to start with the consumer. The consumer has to ask the question, where does this meat come from? And are these healthy animals? Are they grass-fed and free roaming, or are they, so this, I think the consumer is being tasked with being a lot more inquisitive, both being aware and inquisitive when they buy, and how and where they buy their food.
Completely agree. So to summarize the that sort of topic point that we discussed, so the the course of action for the consumer is to ask questions, be more inquisitive, more curious about what they're putting in their bodies, but then perhaps choosing foods like pasture raised, regenerative agriculture, organic, grass fed, these type of things in that meat world. And then in the vegetable world, as chemical free as possible, organic, actually grown in the ground with soil, so you get that conversion process of the polyphenols. And one thing that recently popped up in a study that I read maybe like 2 days ago, there was a study done on particular coffee polyphenols and how those polyphenols actually promote a growth of a certain organism in the gut that's really unknown. All we know that it's a butyrate producer, but it does boost that level of that organism in coffee drinkers. And it was quite a broad study. There was a big cohort. So any insights onto polyphenols like coffee, or could be things like pomegranate? Is there any information you can share around polyphenols and the potential benefits?
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of polyphenols, I have to say. Right now, and I mean I've kind of known this really even before the microbiome science exploded, that plant-based food is healthy because of the fiber content. People have known this for quite some time. And initially, as a gastroenterologist, you saw this because of its benefit on bowel function, on constipation. But that's just a small part of it, really. Um, Fiber is another one of those molecules that do require microbes to break it down, so complex carbohydrates, to break it down into smaller molecules that are then being absorbed in the end of the small intestine or in the colon. For our ancestors, this was a bigger problem because, like before we had fire and cooking and processing ways of plant-based foods, we were totally dependent on these microbes. So now, if you cook or fry something, you already break down a lot of these complex molecules, but there's still a need for the microbial metabolism. With the polyphenols, there's there's lots of there's a big portion of science in the preclinical field, in cell systems, where these polyphenols act as antioxidants. And that's generally what people think about when they talk about polyphenols, or they're antioxidants. Well, they're antioxidants, protecting against free radicals, which are damaging to the cell. But that effect is only when you have this intact large molecule acting on another cell. If you ingest these polyphenols, they can't have that same effect because they can't be absorbed intact. So they're first broken down and then are being absorbed. They have a beneficial effect on, one, the microbes. They nurture the microbes. They increase the diversity. And in addition, the microbes break it down into molecules that are beneficial for us. So eating polyphenols has multiple benefits, from the microbial ecosystem, gut health, to brain health, protection, like protection against early cognitive decline, protection against cardiovascular disease. A couple of really large-scale, well-controlled trials, which is rare in the food era. But definitely they do exist for some of these polyphenols. So one is called flavonol, which is contained also in cacao beans, and many berries. So that's yeah. So there's a lot of evidence. Unfortunately, for the polyphenol field, it was very popular. I don't know, it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago, where it was sort of this explosion of interest in antioxidants. And then, the FDA put up a website where you can look at the antioxidant potential of each, polyphenol, and industry jumped on it. The supplement industry jumped on it. But then it was shown in experiments, if you ate these polyphenols either as extracts, or in the form of the whole fruit, that very little of that parent compound showed up in the blood. And the FDA ultimately took down their website, and this whole field got sort of tainted. So people said this was really not a clinically relevant effect that we saw in these cell cultures. It's gradually coming back now. Now that we know why these parent molecules were not detectable in the blood because they're not absorbed intact. I think there's a growing interest, and I personally think it's one of the most interesting parts of a largely plant-based diet, um, essentially adding to the health benefits of the fiber and fermented food. So like you have three components of, that you could say make up most of the health benefit of a largely plant-based diet: fiber, polyphenols, and fermented foods.
That's incredible. That's like the perfect jumping off spot to go into your wheelhouse, which is using diet and food and things like that to really impact mental health, which is really the star of the show. But I just want to come back to that polyphenol and why those molecules didn't show up in the blood. So is that because it had to go into the gut to be converted by the microbes? Is that why it didn't show up?
Yeah, it couldn't be absorbed in the form that it was taking up, or it was eaten, because it was too large. And so we first had to travel down in the called the ileum, the last part of the small intestine, where they already have a high concentration of microbes. It's just not just the large intestine; it's also, the end of the small intestine. It had to travel down there, and then again, it was not absorbed intact, but broken down. So the pieces into much smaller phenol molecules, those could be absorbed, and they also fed at the same, as I said earlier, at the same time these smaller molecules fed the microbes to thrive. And I mean, I always say, uh, identifying a healthy diet is always a diet that's good for our microbes, which is, the fiber and the polyphenols and the fermented foods. If you just focus on that, you can automatically get the maximum health benefits of your diet.
Absolutely agree. And one of these important factors is something called gut microbiome diversity, and how consuming all these different types of plant fibers, polyphenols, and molecules that are similar foster microbiome diversity. So, are you able to speak to how important microbiome diversity is for our mental well-being? And are there any specific bacterial strains that you believe are non-negotiable for optimal brain health?
There's a lot of speculation that you have to use there. So there's studies, people have looked at this, how how diversity, which means how many different types of microbes are there, and richness, which means how much of each of those strains are there. So it's not just, you could have diversity of having one strain of 1,000 strains in your gut. This would not give you the healthy microbiome. You need the richness, the number of these. So just like, I mean, ecosystems of the microbiome is an ecosystem. It's just like if you think about a city is an ecosystem. If you have a large diversity of professions, of people from different parts of the world, not just one person. So if you get one person from, a one African country, it's not going to add to the diversity of the health of your city. If you have different, you know, significant numbers of people from different parts of the world, I think there's no question. I mean, London is a good example. Los Angeles is a good example. I mean, all the big metropolis, showed that phenomenon, that it's that diversity and richness. If that translates directly into brain health, so people have looked at these studies. They were not as clear cut as you would hope, they should be. Um, so, I mean, decreased diversity, or today we sort of, when you want to define what are the criteria for a healthy microbiome, it sort of goes back to ecosystem health in general. Any ecosystem that you take, being in the ocean, being in the forest, being in cities, it sort of has the same basic underlying principles. It's what we talked about, multiple players in sufficient numbers that are all interconnected. So this interconnectedness concept is a key, to that. And so when we do these studies today and we sort of correlate, like you take normal populations in the US or in the UK, I mean, they're not really the normal that you would find if you go to the hunter-gatherer remnants in the Amazon or on the Orinoco River, who have these ancient microbiomes, which are much more diverse, much richer. So we don't have that anymore. So our healthy control groups in our studies already depleted of many of these ancient microbes. And so some people have warned, there's a book out, Missing Microbes, from a highly recommendable book by Martin Blazer, where he sort of describes this process, how gradually we're losing more and more of these ancient microbes. Just we're losing species everywhere in all our ecosystems, but that's happening internally as well. So to compare, to take a population that doesn't have a disease yet, it doesn't mean that they have the healthiest microbiome, and so I would say in general, we know it more from the other side. So if we improve the diet, which often generally means improving, going more towards a 75% plant-based diet, like the Mediterranean or the Okinawan diet or other sort of diets around the world, they all have the same principle. If you make interventions or do epidemiological studies, and there's many of these epidemiological studies, that's in general associated, not causative, but associated with healthier brain function, both in terms of emotional disorders, but also I think a big focus now is on this early cognitive decline, brain inflammation, low-grade brain inflammation and degeneration. And I think there is pretty good evidence to link this to the microbiome, in many ways. So just looking at the diversity and richness doesn't give you the same clear-cut effects as is now suggested by these epidemiological association, large-scale association studies. There's studies like the Harvard Public Health School is sort of the leader in this, putting out these. So there's the Harvard Nurse Study, tens of thousands of male and female nurses being followed over a long period of time. So those studies show that health benefit, of a healthy diet. It's not, these studies have not included from the beginning the microbiome diversity. I would love to see that. Is there a close association as we suspect there should be?
Are there any types of bacteria? It could be as broad as you want or as specific as you want. You could go down to the psychobiotic realm, or you could talk broadly about the types of bacteria that are very important for mental health.
Yeah, I would say the simplest answer to this is to say, right now, when we talk about good bacteria or beneficial bacteria, in general, they are effective butyrate producers. So taking complex carbohydrate or fiber molecules and breaking them down into these smaller anti-inflammatory, I mean, they not only have anti-inflammatory effects, but have many other benefits, nurturing effects on the gut lining. And I would say at the brain level, the anti-inflammatory component is probably the most important one. So you could almost say, even if you're on an unhealthy diet, if you eat enough food components that generate butyrate, that would compensate for the negative effects of, let's say, yeah, a lot of red meat consumption or high fat consumption. It's almost a yin and yang. If it's the balance, if you produce enough for these anti-inflammatory molecules, and there are certain bacteria, um, um, that are the top butyrate producers that we know, and the number of these bacteria goes up if you go on a plant-based diet. There's also another one got a lot of attention, Akkermansia.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's a microbe that plays a big role in the mucus shouldn't say mucus production in the mucus regulation. So the mucus in intestine is a key component of the intestinal permeability. So a lack of this mucus layer is associated with an increased permeability, or in lingual, it's the leaky gut. So Akkermansia is an interesting organism because it can feed on the mucus, which are like, could say in the widest sense, sugar molecules. So if you don't eat a high fiber diet, then and your gut microbes don't get enough fiber, so Akkermansia has a mechanism to survive while just switching to mucus consumption. And it's not just a consumption of mucus, but that triggers also through this organism an increased production of new mucus. So essentially what Akkermansia does, it changes the turnover, which appears to be a health promoting effect. So somewhat different from the butyrate production. And then you could say there's some bad microbes, that play a role in the conversion of tryptophan to molecules. So tryptophan is the precursor of serotonin, which we all, so we like that hormone. It's been called a happy hormone, which is kind of an exaggeration, but there's other metabolites that can be generated from this essential amino acid, tryptophan, that balance between serotonin and another one of these metabolites, kynurenine or indoles, that balance. So the kynurenine is not a healthy metabolite. If it gets to the brain, it can actually lead to increased excitability of nerve cells and degeneration. So there's, the microbes would play a role in this metabolite and this metabolism of tryptophan also play a role. So there's multiple mechanisms. One is in the generation of beneficial, what we call neuroactive substances that are good for the brain. Another one is Akkermansia that improves the mucus layer and the barrier in the gut. And then the third one are just complex carbohydrates, which lead to butyrate production. So these are just three examples, of how different population of microbes can contribute to gut and brain health.
Amazing. I'm highly cognizant of your time, so I don't want to take too much of your time. So we'll start to wrap up. But I'd be extremely appreciative if you come back and do a round two and we can go deeper into the gut brain axis. But just one final question, then we'll start to end the podcast. Because I think you mentioned fermented foods, and I think it's worth exploring that just a little bit. So there's a whole gamut of different fermented foods that people can consume. So examples might be kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, natto, miso soup, all these type of beneficial foods that we can consume that can contain other microbes like probiotic type organisms or beneficial bacteria, beneficial metabolites, postbiotics, prebiotics. So how do these fermented foods exert a positive impact on mental health?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, again, preclinical studies, mouse studies that have shown that different different micro. So with fermented foods, per se, fermented foods are not probiotics. So for probiotics, there has to be a demonstration of there has to be scientific evidence that they have a health benefit. We don't have this for sauerkraut, for example. There's not a
Hmm.
control study. I don't even know how you would control it.
Hmm.
But um, for for these for many of the molecules, the microbes that are characteristic for for fermented foods like lactobacilli and bifido, which are two of the most common ones, they there's evidence from these in vitro studies that they have beneficial effects on the permeability of the gut and inflammation. And um, those are very difficult to reproduce, these findings in human studies, in intact human studies, and there's few of them. Um, but so I sort of lost my train of thought right now where I want to go with this. Um, there was a recent study that was recent, like a couple of years ago, that was kind of interesting and was, I think, against what the investigators had suspected, that people that consumed a diet rich in different fermented foods um, had a greater initial benefit for, you know, decreasing inflammation molecules in the body and for diversity and the health of the microbiome than the people that consumed a diet rich in various fiber-containing foods. And the most interesting part about this study was that they found it wasn't the organisms that were contained in the probiotic in these fermented foods. It was other organisms that were then all of a sudden detected in the gut. And I don't think has been resolved by the investigators where these other molecules came from. Were they already present in the gut in sub-detectable levels? Or were they introduced with wherever this fermented food came from, from um, contaminants, so to speak, of the fermented foods. Um, but I think that study has kind of really generated a renewed interest in the benefits of fermented foods. And I personally think about it, this is what I recommend to my patients, instead of, now going for the latest probiotic pill or capsule, just introduce multiple fermented foods into your diet, depending on your preference and food tolerance. And I think a lot of people are doing this in different parts in the US, but it's not, you know, there's still the perception you have to get your probiotic pill in order to get, to get the benefits of fermented foods. Um, Ultimately, how this will be decided, I always feel with healthy foods, it's better if you eat a diet that is rich in these ingredients than eating the pills. But then there's a lot of the big parts of the population that have insufficient levels of, for example, the polyphenol intake or fermented food intake, and they may live in food deserts, or they may not be able to afford, the kind of foods that other people living in more privileged areas have. So for those individuals, I think the supplementation with pills that are enriched in these beneficial molecules is probably the best way to go. So it's not one size fits all. I think we have to sort of determine who are the customers, do they have access to this healthy food and to 5 different fermented foods. So many ethnic groups have it. They when they maintain their cultures, even though they may not have these same affluent supermarkets that are, in the posh parts of London or Los Angeles. Um, so yeah.
What's become hugely popular at the moment in the zeitgeist is people using popular strains like Lactobacillus reuteri and making yogurt-like products out of it. So opening up capsules and then fermenting it in a yogurt maker. Have you come across that before?
I've not come across it. There must be something that in the UK is you guys.
Well, there's a little bit of a craze going on. I think it was popularized by Dr. William Davis, another guest of our podcast. But what he advocates is to use these particular strains. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no really proven probiotic strains in fermented foods. The only outlier would be something like a yogurt, where they might make yogurts with the probiotic strains. But then what Dr. William Davis is talking about is you open up the capsule, or they even sell it as powders, and then you put that in the yogurt maker, so you boost up the strains of these probiotic organisms. So
That's in-
that it's really interesting, fascinating. It's a bit of a craze at the moment. So I'm sure people will check that out. Previous episode with Dr. William Davis to learn more. But Dr. Emeran Mayer, thank you so much for your time. I could speak to you for another 5, 6 hours easily, but I want to get you started with the rest of your day. I know you're extremely busy and you have lots of stuff going on. But if people want to reach out to you, they've loved this podcast, they want to find your books, they want to find you online, how do people find you?
I think the simplest way is just to go to my website, emeranmayer.com, and you can sign up for our newsletter. You can, it's a collection of all the podcasts, of all the posts that were part of our newsletter. We always deposit them in the on the website as well. Yeah, I would say if you don't want to, if you haven't read any of my books, I mean, this is definitely the simplest way to go to, and they're making big improvements on the website and the ease to access this information. So I should mention one thing. I wish, because I'm at this scientific meeting here. It's the American College of Neuropharmacology, and it's kind of ironic that we have this conversation right in the middle of it. And there was a part of this meeting, a 1.5 hour workshop on psychedelics, which is actually one right after this conversation that we have. This has become a hot topic in psychiatry and in medicine as well. And there was a talk, so talking about the role of the microbes, where the microbes, have receptors on them, that these serotonin receptors that these psychedelics like psilocybin stimulate in the brain. But there's different phases of the psychedelic action. There's the initial visual, experience, and then there's a prolonged period where, your verbal communication increases, and then there's month-long effects as well. And so there was a presenter, and I've thought about this idea for a long time, that the delayed effects, may easily have to do with what these components of the mushroom do to the microbes. I would bet my money on it right now that I would say this is going to be another area that will, because I mean, these long-term effects seem to be beneficial. People talk about neuroplastic effects. It changes the brain circuits, and that the studies going on in refractory depression and in PTSD, and it may well be, if we had this conversation in 5 years from now, this could be one of the main topics that we're talking about. I just wanted to throw this in because I'm
Amazing.
in 5 minutes and returning to that.
That's incredible. You've dropped so many amazing nuggets right through this episode, things that I've never heard before. And this is about bringing this cutting edge research straight from your conference directly to the general public to absorb and take on. So thank you so much. And I'd love to end on this note, slightly different to normal. But if there's one thing you could do for your gut brain connection today, what would that be?
One thing, I think that if you had to limit it to one thing, I would say focus on a healthy diet, which in its components percentages is like the Mediterranean or similar diets, which is grown organically, ideally, in the regenerative organic fashion. Um, I think that would be the number one. I think of the evidence that we have today, that would be the one. There's many experimental things that are going on, but I think focusing on the diet part would be important.
Thank you so much. Amazing. Dr. Emeran Mayer.
Okay, thanks, Krivind. Wonderful conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.